afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Rosa Cabrera, Director of the UIC Rafael Cintron Ortiz Latino Cultural Center, better known as the LCC. Thank you for joining us in this Zona Abierta online presentation to celebrate Women's History Month. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors, the UIC Gender and Women's Studies and Latin American and Latino Studies program. For those of you who are not familiar with Zona Abierta, this is an LCC series that highlights the intersection of the arts, humanities, science, culture, and civic life with presentations by local, national, and international artists, scholars, and community leaders about pressing social and environmental issues affecting the lives of Latinx and Latin Americans while making connection to other communities, especially in the Chicago area. Today's programs in honors of Mujeres and mothers in movements for social justice will be led by 4 extraordinary local and national Latinx women leaders who are coming together to reflect and share their experiences across social justice movements focused on education, labor, immigration, and environmental and climate change. We will hear their personal trajectories and respective roles within these movements and the complexities of existing as mujeres, mothers, parents, and leaders. Their conversation will be about 40 to 50 minutes, and then we should have about 30 minutes or so to engage with them. So we invite you to put comments and questions on the chat while they're talking so that the moderator and LCC staff can help direct this to our guest speakers. So now with great pleasure, I would like to introduce our guest speakers. I will start with our moderator, Rebecca Martinez from Chicago Teachers Union. Rebecca comes to this space with over 20 years of community and labor organizing. A daughter of Mexican immigrants who laid roots in Little Village, she was deeply impacted in 2001 when she witnessed members of her community rise up in a 19-day hunger strike to make then Mayor Daley fulfill his promise to build a new high school in Little Village. This was the beginning of her commitment to fighting for education justice. For the last 9 years, Rebecca has been an organizer and recently the director of organizing for the Chicago Teachers Union. This is a union of over 25,000 members who in the past 10 years has transformed into a social justice and racial justice union. Rebecca continues to live in Little Village with her spouse and 2-year-old child, doing what ordinary people are meant to do, make radical change. Our 3 panelists are Gabriel Martinez Benitez, Vivian Moreno, and Evelyn Osorio. Gabriela Marquez Benitez is a mama of 2 chiquitines currently living in Virginia. She is the chief director at Detention Watch Network, a national coalition of organizations and individuals seeking to end immigration detention. Gabriela was born in Chihuahua, Mexico, and migrated to Memphis at the age of 6. Coming from a family that has been directly affected by the detention and deportation machine, she has a strong commitment to immigrant community organizing. Gabriela is a graduate from the University of Memphis and obtained her master's degree in Latin American and Latino Studies here at UIC. Viviana Moreno is a community organizer and urban farmer in the city of Chicago. Born in Venezuela, Viviana aims to weave her South American values with local food systems to reach Black and Brown communities in Chicago around ownership and control of our food chains. Vivi is part of the Little Village environmental organization team known as El Vejo. She's also one of 3 workers owners in the emerging Catatumbo Cooperative Farm. This is an evolving workers organization that cultivates and harvests affordable, nutritious, sustainable, grown, and cultural relevant products for Latinx, immigrant, people of color, and low-income neighborhoods in Chicago and surrounding community. And then we have Evelyn Osorio, who is a mother of two, a woman in the labor movement, an activist, a Chicago native, UIC alum, and a child care field coordinator and organizer in one of the largest unions in the Midwest. This is the Service Employees International Union, healthcare in Illinois, known as SEIU. Her work includes advocating for a universal child care system where families can access free, high-quality child care, workers making a livable wage, and them having a right to a union. She has a dedicated track record of issue advocacy and volunteer work, especially regarding the rights of immigrants and non-native English speakers. She has worked with SEIU since 2013 and was formerly involved with the Immigrant Youth Justice League and the Albany Park Autonomous Center. In her community, she's a volunteer activist for People United Albany Park, organizing against police violence affecting Black and Brown working class community. Welcome y bienvenidas to our virtual community. All of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rosa, for that. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Gabriel Martinez. I'm with the Chicago Teachers Union, and I will be your moderator for today. And I'm actually really humbled and very honored to be invited to be the moderator for this panel and to be on the panel with such powerful women who I actually feel very much a personal connection to each one of you, whether through location, through Little Village, and the work that Vivi does in helping to transform our neighborhood and our climate, and personal relationships that I have with like Gabi and my union sister, Evelyn Osorio, which, you know, CTU and SEIU, HCII are actually very, very strongly aligned and allied or unions in the city of Chicago. So I'm very, very excited to be talking with all of you and to see such a beautiful little baby on the screen. So thank you. I do want to just say a little bit about myself. I know that I had a short introduction, but I do want to share a little bit about me and how I came into this work. And I hope that after that, I will call on the members of the panel to also say more about themselves. Again, I am from Little Village, born and raised there. My parents are Mexican immigrants. They were actually immigrants in the 70s and the 80s, undocumented immigrants in the 70s and the 80s. Worked in factories throughout my whole childhood, and later in the 2000s, my mom was actually a domestic worker for some time, and then a senior care provider. Right, so she took care of senior citizens. So a lot of this work that you all do is very, very, very much deeply felt and experienced. So, you know, I really got into education work mostly like when in my introduction, right? That like people in my community decided to take action to get what was necessary, which at that time was the promise for a new high school in an overcrowded neighborhood. And something that should have been basic because another two schools were built, one Northside College Prep and Walter Payton Prep that were also promised were built, right? And so they used our money to build those schools. And we know that those today are the best schools in the state. And so that really got me involved in education work, but also in really seeing the power of community and how as ordinary people, we are the ones who make a difference in this world. And really made me, I always felt like it was somebody else's role to do that, right? It was always somebody else who was better at speaking in public, taking action, doing something, right? And then that's when I felt the power of just being an ordinary person and rising to the occasion to fight and defend your community. And so that really was the initiation for me to really look at community organizing as a way to transform the education world, but also our communities. And so I think that's really the reason why I do this work. And, you know, one of the experiences that shaped my love for young people as well is that I worked at Farragut High School and saw the inequity and how brilliant the students were and how limited the opportunities provided were. And just really feeling the injustice of that, because of being students of color, because of being immigrant, because they were working class and working poor. Like those were all the reasons why they were denied access to opportunities. And that really also played a huge role in wanting to pursue education justice work. And so there's been many, many moments in my life where I have feel transformed. And those are just some of the first ones that I feel played a significant role in my life. And I want to now turn it over to Gabi, if you can share a little bit more about yourself and your interest, your upbringing, the current work that you do, and how your family influenced the work that you do today.
Yeah, hi everyone. Buenas tardes. Gabriela, also known as Gabi, and I'm also very humbled and grateful to be in the space with such powerful mujeres. But yeah, I'm based out of the DC area at the moment. Looks like my sound is a little faint. Can you hear me better now? No? Okay, let's see.
Try it again.
Great. How about now?
Yes.
Is that better? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, so I'm currently out of the DC area, but as mentioned in the bio, I'm originally from Mexico, from Chihuahua, and I'm currently doing and have been involved a lot in immigrant rights work. We migrated when I was coming into first grade, and I was raised in the South. I was raised in Tennessee and in Mississippi, where the new Latino destination was up and coming in the mid-90s, and there was not much other fellow immigrant communities or heavily like historic immigrant communities, Latinx communities, particularly Mexicano communities in that area. And soon after we migrated, I kind of learned the reality of the flawed immigrant system that the United States has, by my parents being directly impacted. I was in school, and next thing you know, my parents were not home. And it definitely, at the moment, I wasn't aware of what was going on, being the eldest. I just knew that, you know, I needed to be around my siblings. And later on, after we remigrated back to the US, we were impacted again. So little did I know that my family had been at the hands of ICE twice at this point. through work raids in the 90s and again in 2009. Both of my parents had been detained at this time. And in 2009, I was in college and I had already sort of like been connected to social justice movement work through youth immigrant rights organizing for the so-called DREAM Act at that point. And by the time my dad was detained again in 2009, I had already connected with a beautiful community that was able to stand alongside us and also organize and fight for us. Luckily, my parents are still here. Because of organizing, my dad was able to fight and win his case. And the work of detention very much hit us. At that point, I became aware of the private detention system. I became aware of the many cages that exist within the US and how immigrants are incarcerated and how that impacts particularly our Black and Brown communities. So I'm now at Detention Watch Network, and we work to particularly end the immigrant detention system, which has looked very, very different among the various administrations. And what hasn't changed is the willingness of our communities to fight, particularly in this space. I want to talk about the mothers that are fighting in that space. So I'll pause there and pass it on to colega Evelyn.
I was expecting to be last, but I'm a mom of 2 kids and currently expecting my 3rd. And I think that, it's new for folks to know, and it's not new for some folks, but I think that for me, as a mom of 2 kids, knowing kind of like how my parents came into this country was like very crucial, and just like how I've seen them kind of navigate the systems that exist in the US. And like my parents were lucky enough to have some sort of status back, in the 80s. But both my parents came when they were teenagers, pretty much, right? That's what it was back then. My dad would even joke around, family members and buddies when I was smaller and say like, yeah, the thing is when you get caught by immigration, you just gotta lie and say you're older than 18. So they'll send you back and you don't fall into the system of, underage children end up in like a DCFS kind of different system, right? Versus getting just tossed back. And both my parents, like Rebecca's, factory workers, there was ICE called on my dad a few times and him kind of like using another door to get out as soon as he could. And it wasn't like a really viable thing to continue to work in factories, especially when you're like a vulnerable brown man who, is having difficulty just kind of saying yes to the people around you. And so for him, he kind of left the workspace maybe in his 40s and just started doing his own kind of entrepreneurship thing. And it's worked for him. But I think that, he was lucky enough. My mom, no. My mom continues to work at a meatpacking factory, right? Because that's kind of all she's known. And as much as I try to kind of push her away from it, she feels comfortable in this space, right? She has a union, she has benefits, and is going to continue to do that as long as like she can. And I think for me, my trajectory into organizing is a little bit different. I think because my parents, didn't struggle with immigration policies when I was growing up. I really didn't see that. I didn't recognize that until I was in high school and saw my friends who were undocumented and in high school and just figuring out college options. I mean, for me, it was kind of like, well, my brother's in college, my sister's in college, I'm going to go to college. And it seemed like my grades we're in a good direction. But at the same time, I was in one of the less fortunate high schools in the city of Chicago, even though it's on the northwest side, very close to North College Prep. It's Roosevelt High School, and it's always been kind of starved for resources. So we, didn't have the best resources, but we had amazing staff. Our post-secondary coach was just amazing and had very resourceful human being that I think fought for us as much as she could while she was there. And for me, it was like, back then, a few friends who didn't have those opportunities, and it was like really hard for me to understand like why those opportunities weren't available to them. Went to college, obviously in high school, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know I could do anything about it. But going to UIC and going to the Coming Out of the Shadows in 2010, I think Vivi was in that group before I kind of joined it. And then Gabby was in IJL, right, as I was leaving. So I think we all kind of could have crossed paths a little bit more, but didn't. But are cross our passing now. And I think that, that kind of trajectory for me of like going to the Coming Out of the Shadows and like the power of storytelling, that really like shook me. It like changed my trajectory of my life of like individualism. I'm gonna finish this and I'm gonna do the next thing, right? Until like there's a bigger calling out there of like we can do something about what's impacting people around us and people that we love, right? My partner and co-parent is undocumented, right? And so for us, it's always been kind of like, oh, we'll figure it out. But knowing that we can't figure it out, right? It's a system that continues to separate families, that continues to like feel that some people are more deserving than others, is something that we need to dismantle together. So even though right now in my work, as a childcare field coordinator, I don't directly work around issues that are impacting undocumented folks. I am bringing awareness about those issues that are impacting and bringing in more allies into the movement with the work I do. And so I'm really glad I stayed as long as I have as a labor organizer and being able to bring a real important racial justice lens to my work. And on a personal level, I'm extremely politically involved. I didn't note that at the beginning, but it's just something so important that I also understood early on through the IJL days when we did direct actions, I think on the least expected politicians. But at the same time now, right, it's like the politicians, our aldermen, our state representatives, everybody in this whole country who has some political position is basically determining the air that we breathe, the water that we drink. And for me, I'm not gonna just sit there and wait to see what happens. And so for me, getting politically involved in my personal life and in my community is something that I hold very dearly. And that I'm gonna as a mom, it's become very challenging. I think I talked to Rebecca about this, but it's like before I was out there getting their petitions, I was out there getting, recruiting more volunteers. I was doing a whole bunch of work, but it looks completely different now that you're a mom. So maybe we'll get into that a little bit later. But something that I never shied away is about really speaking up against police violence affecting Black and Brown working class communities. It's really difficult, I think, because we're all touched by a police officer. My brother is a police officer, and I don't think I've ever said that publicly. But my children have a very huge political lens when it comes to policing, and are very brutally honest, I think, when it comes to police are shooting our Black and Brown men and understanding why it happens. And so for me, it's difficult to navigate that space, but I think it's just so important for our children to know, or at least my children to know, that there are systems in place that are, not protecting our Black and Brown people, that are specifically set up for white people in this country to keep succeeding, right? Even the gatekeeping that exists in big academia is something that I'm very open to talking about. So I know I've taken a lot of time. I'll pass it over to Vivi.
Hi, everyone. That was fire for both of y'all. Thank you so much for sharing and opening up with just such amazing force. My name is Vivian Moreno, and I'm a food justice organizer and a farmer with Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, with Catotumbo Cooperative Farm, and soon part of the Englewood Village Farm collective of Black and Brown farmers in the Englewood neighborhood. I'm very happy to be here. I also wanted to just express my gratitude for continuing this virtual setting. I know a lot of institutions and a lot of places are kind of going back to in person. So I just want to say thank you for continuing this virtual spaces that are very accessible to a lot of folks. So I think from what I understood in the conversation is how we came to be, how we came to do this work, and how we were influenced by family. I am also an immigrant. Status is all over the place in terms of immigration status still, which makes it it makes a lot of decisions very uncertain as a new parent. I'm a new parent of a wonderful 10-month-old, very, very assertive Taurus. And I'm very grateful to have been chosen as their parent. Actually, my co-parent is here. Taryn is somewhere around here. But yeah, I was born in South America, in Maracaibo, Venezuela, and migrated to the US when I was 13. And a month after we migrated here, I migrated with my mom. My mom is a single mom. We migrated, it was just her and I, which made the transition significantly harder because we didn't necessarily have a big community to come to, a big family to come to. And I think to this day, I don't know that I'm necessarily connected to like a big Venezuelan community, which I feel like has shaped why I floated around to so many kind of like social justice communities, just trying to find a home, and land work ended up feeling like home. A month after we migrated August 2001, a month after 9/11 happened, which, as a lot of folks know, like if you were kind of a recent immigrant in that age, at that time, a lot of things quickly shifted in terms of immigration policy. So whereas the month that we got here, we were probably able to get licenses eventually. And, I have a little bit of a pathway, not quite 9/11 makes things significantly worse. And it completely changed the way that we saw our new place here in the United States. And from that moment on, we knew that we were going to be undocumented for a long time. So I've spent all of my teenage years here in Florida specifically, and that the knowledge of being undocumented, the kind of like growing layers to cover parts of myself, learning coping mechanisms if there's like authorities around, has always been part of kind of like my teenage years and continues to be, unfortunately. So I know there are folks that like don't realize that we're undocumented until later on, but it was really rough to kind of grow up with that in very formative years, and for that to kind of like dictate the way that I move around and the decisions that I've made, right? So I wasn't able to go to school after high school. All of my friends started like going to college and everything, and in Florida there wasn't in-state tuition for undocumented folks, so you had to pay like astronomical out-of-pocket amounts if you wanted to go to a school, and it most likely had to be a private school. So I had no options to go to college. I decided to move out, to move out by myself, to leave my home, which if you come from certain Latinx communities, if you leave your home before you're married and in a new country and you have a single mom, it's like, what are you doing, right? But it was the way that I could survive. For my mental health, I needed to leave Florida. So I traveled around a few states, finding work, literally looking for states that had in-state tuition, and eventually landed in Chicago 12 years ago. That was a long, long search. I landed here and pretty much was by myself, floating around, finding friends. One of my oldest friends in Chicago was a person that I became friends with 2 weeks before I was almost evicted from this place where I was paying like $50 for a room. And if it wasn't for them, I don't think I would still be here in Chicago. And I want to shout them out because they housed me and also started showing me what the social justice community looked like in Chicago. It was, his name is MJ, Mike Johnson, and he actually took me to my first IJO meeting. And I remember going to that meeting, feeling really in awe of seeing, like in my mind, I'm like, I had assumed this personality of being a very kind of scared and private, undocumented person. And then I come into this room and see this like fierce, loud, extremely fashionable, beautifully queer group of young immigrant folks. And I remember feeling so intimidated. And at the same time, part of that intimidation was insecurity, being like, how dare they be so loud? How dare they be so just like fierce and loud about who they are, and how dare they just like have so much force. And I remember going to several meetings and just watching and being like, how can I get to this point of just feeling empowered with myself, even with the limitations that we have, right? So there's like so many Israel folks here that I've met like a long time ago. And also my homie, my sibling here, Ireri, that's my love. I want to give that, I'm trying not to get emotional. But I feel like Israel was one of the spaces that I feel like I first felt welcome in a social justice setting. But again, I think growing up where there is a growing Venezuelan diaspora, but it looks a little bit different politically, because a lot of them tend to be very right-wing leaning, right? So it's really difficult to find a South American, a very political, a very radical Venezuelan community here. And so I think that kind of has dictated why I've been having such a hard time finding a nest and finding a home or a social justice political home, right? Israel, I feel like, became one of the few places where I started to feel good about myself, where I started to feel more unapologetic about myself and not necessarily have to hide. I remember going to the first Coming Out of the Shadows and being terrified, because there were people being like, ICE is gonna be all over the place. And I'm like, oh my God. And the first person I met in that march before that stage was Rosie, Ireri's mom. And I was like, Señora, is it true that ICE is gonna be here? And I was just like, random señora. And I'm like, I need to ask somebody. And she just looks at me, she's like, no, mamita, it's gonna be fine. Just keep walking with us. And I was like, oh, okay, this señora Rosie told me it was fine. And now Señora Rosie, one of the fiercest organizers in Chicago. But I would say, to be honest, I still feel there was something that like still didn't necessarily feel like that was my place to be, my place to put all of my efforts in, and I didn't really know why. I floated around in a few organizing spaces. For those of you that have done education, there was a Whittier Elementary occupation in Pilsen, which was really fierce and also really heartbreaking. It had a really rough ending, but I started getting to know a lot of parents in Pilsen, in a little village, and started becoming a little bit more identified with that community, even though it was a very different community from one that I'm used to, right? I'm used to more like South American or Caribbean, kind of like sazon. I feel like I felt so welcome and warm, and finally felt like it was a good place for me to grow as an organizer. Eventually started working with El Vejo. I've had so many different roles with El Vejo, but I actually am thankful for the organization for letting me find myself within the org, but also for letting me for being welcoming to me in Little Village, and to the way that I completely have fallen in love with the community. And it has been my home for a long, long time now. I started organizing as a climate justice organizer. And then I started organizing as a open space organizer. So as a lot of you know, if you are familiar with La Villita is a very dense neighborhood and also a very industrial neighborhood. 30% of the neighborhood is industrial, right? So we are surrounded by industry that's currently polluting our air, our water, our soil. And it has been for the past like 80, 90 years. It just happens to be the way that the neighborhood was built. And one of the big campaigns that El Vejo has had for a long time is advocating for more open space, but specifically community control spaces, which look very different from just having an open space. So as the park organizer, we started fighting for La Vita Park to be open on the eastern side of the neighborhood, which is right next to Cook County Jail. It's actually quite a sight if you're at the park. It's such a stark contrast between families playing freely outside and folks incarcerated in jail, right? There's a lot of complicated feelings about that. A lot of folks are like, why would you advocate for a park that's right next to a jail? And I feel like my response would always be like, there have been families living in front of that jail already for decades. Why shouldn't they also deserve to have open spaces as well? And eventually, right next to the park, there's a really beautiful place. It's a half-acre garden called Semillas de Justicia Community Garden. And that really was the place where I became a farmer, I became a gardener, and where I developed a love and devotion for working with the land. And I would say ultimately where I found my organizing home, which is in land sovereignty and advocating for folks to have community control of spaces. To me, land is where a lot of problems stem from. If community doesn't have access to land, but also community control of the land, a lot of really horrible decisions by local politicians happen, like harmful developments, like gentrification, like schools not being built when they need to be built, like funding not going to community programs the way they need to go. And so land justice is kind of where I found my home. The mothers from Semillas were the ones that first taught me how to plant flowers. And it was that moment where I became completely obsessed with land work, with connected to the land, and also with being in community with other immigrants, with other folks that weren't necessarily from the United States, but were finding a really important sense of healing by working with the land, which became a different type of organizing, right? It's more of a spiritual organizing, it's cultural organizing, and it's like a reaching back to who we were organizing. I have the honor to work with a lot of really amazing immigrant land workers that have really deep histories, specifically in Mexico and Central America, working the land organically and at length, and employing really powerful indigenous gardening and farming practices. And I'm really excited to be continuing to do that work now. Currently, we're trying to build more in terms of build more farms, and really transform what it means to work the land as immigrants. I feel like the only mirror that we have is of an exploited immigrant or folks that just don't have access to organic, healthy food, right? Or even the term clean food, which tends to be like, oh, it's organic, it's good for you, but it usually tends to have really horrible labor practices right behind it, right? So what does it look like to change our image of us working the land that is not tarnished by a harmful kind of legacy of being forced to work the land, of being forced to migrate so we can work the land and still not have access to food? So what does it look like to work the land in a way that is autonomous, that is at our own pace, physically and spiritually, and be able to also bring our practices in so we can nourish our community the way that we want to be nourished. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, there were so many moments where listening to you all just felt a lot of the emotion, the pain, but also just so much love that it's really beautiful. There's like so many directions we can go, like so many themes to like pick up, but I do want to say, because everybody is connected to IJO apparently, my experience isn't of an undocumented immigrant, right? Yes, true. And not being a white American in this country comes with so much also, right? So a lot of the internalized racism is deep. And I want to say that like seeing IJO, right? And seeing the young people from IJO and like being, like Vivi said, being unapologetic and like daring to be bold, it was really probably some of the most powerful images that I had experienced that made me feel like it was okay to be bold. It was okay to speak out. It was okay to dare, to dream, to imagine, to do all the things that we have been told, whether you're immigrant or not immigrant, that we can't do. So I just really like the way that movements work, right? That movements really do transform beyond just the people who are part of that, right? That they really have transformed our psyche and the way that we feel about who we are and how we are part of this world. So just thank you to all the IJO folks who made us, who we are. I did want to there's a couple of threads that I want to poke at. I think there's a little bit of, where does our relationship with around race, right? In this within our context of organizing, I heard a little bit of like, how do we negotiate our role as moms, women, activists, and, you know, and so I want to like take on those two threads, right? So I know that for me, I could do anything I wanted to before I had my child. And I could stay up super late working and could, you know, decide on a limb that I was going to go and to that protest. And I could stand face to face to a police officer, and that was going to be what I was going to do. And I can't exactly do that today. And so I'm just wondering, like, how becoming a mom has changed the way that you make decisions, what you decide to focus on. How do you decide? How has it changed the way that you organize? And do you feel like it has hindered your involvement, or if it's like bolstered it, right? Bolstered your organizing skills and your vision and your heart has gotten bigger because of it. Like, what has been your experience with it? Evelyn, Gabby, Vivi, who wants to go next? Who wants to take a stab at it?
Yeah, I can start off since I kind of mentioned it in my intro. So my kids, they're big now, and it's crazy to think, but I have a 6-year-old. She turned 6 in February, and my son's 4.5. Looking forward to turning 5, and one on the way. So for me, I think when they were little, it was easy. I'm not going to say having a baby in your hand is easy. I'm just saying, like, you can keep them up at night and you can hang out with them, I think, after long meetings. It's just completely different, right? You can have them at your own schedule, especially because, like, me and my partner, like, both do very similar work in organizing in the community. So it's like we would take turns kind of being a parent with our kids, like in a physical space, and like, okay, we got this. And then they became school age kids. And this is where, like, the headache comes in of, like, you do have to navigate what spaces you want to be in, or you can be in. You want to be in all the spaces that you were in before. But I think that you're a little bit more selfish with your time. And I think that people are more understanding about it. And honestly, I feel that because my children are growing up in community and in spaces where they're learning a lot of stuff that I wasn't, right, when I was growing up, I didn't have access to. I feel that as a mom, like, I'm doing the right thing, right? And so I think for me to continue to be in those spaces is kind of, I want to keep doing that, not just for myself, but for them, because they're learning, you know, a lot of more around what's fair and, like, calling out stuff where they see it being unfair. My daughter's really good at it. She also has an amazing kindergarten teacher who is really taking it upon herself to do, like, a Women's History Month and, like, really going above and beyond, learning about Ruby Bridges and Black History Month, and, like, really kind of breaking it down for children who are, like, 5 and 6, which I very fortunate enough, without even looking, for a teacher like that. I think my daughter kind of landed the jackpot, because I don't remember it growing up in elementary school or high school, like, any teacher kind of bringing up very important topics, but I think also very, what you can call sensitive. And so I think for me, as a mom, it's kind of like my duty as a mom in, like, the racial justice movement, like, to be teaching my kids when to call stuff out and how to be be a part of making change. So I'm just going to pass it over to Gabby, because I think she's going to talk.
Thanks, Evelyn. Yeah, that's really hopeful to hear because I'm still very much new in the mom world and motherhood. So I have 2 children and un pequeñín that's 2.5, and this little one that's a month old now. So it's still very new. And also think like Rebecca and Vivian also, we hit motherhood in a very particular time of a pandemic. And I think that's also like another layer where at least I feel like I need to adjust in terms of like how my role has changed in movement spaces, how it's shifted. But similarly, you know, from being really engaged in work like petition drives and direct actions and like community base building work, and those long meetings, right? By the time that we chose parenthood, I had been involved in community organizing work for about a decade. So my role had been very, very particular to that, although always learning, right? But I had also reached the point where I needed to shift my role, even before giving birth. And I think part of that is also being able to listen to yourself, listen to your body, listen to your mind. And I think what happened at that point is that I shifted from organizing to membership work at a national organization that's not very much like the direct community work that I had been used to. But soon after the pandemic hit, and although I was at DWN, my work has shifted, my role has shifted from organizing to membership work. I was still very involved in OCAD and organized communities against deportations, and the local work in La Viejita. And being at home with my abuelita, who was helping us, and as a role and something also to name in terms of mothering, that it takes more than it really does take a community. It really does take a village, and my abuelita was able to move in with us to help us out as Amaru was born. But because she's also immunocompromised, that was another layer to the pandemic, where, you know, at the peak of the uprisings, you know, I was not able to go out to the marches like I had been, right? I was not able to take my little one out to the streets, and everything became virtual, right? So I think one is still navigating coming into the phase of motherhood, to like navigating what that looks like in what is still very much a pandemic. and 3, also on top of that, also moving, right? Or continuing our migration journey from being in Chicago for almost a decade to moving to the DC area and leaving my organizing familia and community behind physically, right? But I think part of that is also just recognizing that, like, mothering in the movement for me has been just beautiful and a challenge experience thus far, especially as we are unlearning as a collective, unlearning both like what society has instilled in us, and also like the traditional schools, right, has connected, has instilled in us. But becoming a mother during the pandemic, it has been often for me like connecting online with my community, and still very much finding a way to be involved and engaged where I can. And also just recognizing that mothers are at the forefront of our movements, right? Like in OCAD, like it's the mothers who are fighting for their sons who are detained, or their husbands who are in detention, or they themselves, right? Like in the work that I do at DWN, like mothers who are organizing and resisting from inside detention with their little ones, and continuing that work outside once they're released, to also support others who are still in detention. So I think just recognizing that our roles can shift as mothers, based on our, you know, what we have at our disposal, but also based on like the dire need to be present for that radical change. Yeah, I can pass it on to Vivi for that.
Thank you, Gabby and Evelyn. Gabby, thank you for touching on the pandemic. I feel like that's where I'm mostly kind of identifying right now. Again, I'm a new parent. We haven't hit the toddler years, but I can see them now. They're definitely knocking at the door. I would say more than anything, the pandemic has really shaped the way that I have parented so far. We made a choice to conceive our baby at the height of the pandemic, when vaccines weren't a thing. We were actually delaying the process of conception. We are a queer couple too. And so I feel like that in itself has shaped the way that we have approached like motherhood and parenthood, just because conceiving, it was a very clinical process for us, was very much shaped by the pandemic. It was delayed by the pandemic. It was schedules and cycles all affected by the pandemic, which made us kind of coming into parenthood a little bit more difficult. And then it was the kind of choice to be like, okay, I'm about to be pregnant, and also and because of that, an immunocompromised person during the pandemic. And that was really scary. I definitely withdrew from from all the marches, from all the protests, but it was really heartbreaking because we were also seeing our communities being really, really tragically affected by COVID. Specifically Little Village. We a lot of the folks that we work with on the land, we ended up, a lot of them ended up passing away. A lot of the young people we work with, we kept hearing of their parents passing away. The few times we would convene in the gardens, we would hear about their mistreatment in hospitals, how a lot of them were fearing for their lives because personnel wouldn't speak Spanish, couldn't speak Spanish and refused to give them translation. A lot of fears of them coming back to the garden as a way to healing from feeling like they were going to die because nobody was kind of looking out for them. So there was definitely a lot of trauma as a result of the pandemic. And that was all embedded in the food work, right? Like the food work was the place where we all convened and told these stories to each other while I was, cooking up a little baby. And so I would say that I was definitely, and I think I will be honest, I was definitely very scared about what was going to happen, and also seeing growing resistance to community protection, like growing resistance to masks, right? As the pandemic kept getting worse, there was growing resistance to vaccines, growing resistance to protecting essential workers and paying people paying people living wages, and also seeing community members lose their jobs, not have access to food. I would say I found my place as a new parent and as a food systems working within the pandemic, right? So what I was able to tap into was emergency food access, which I had never done before. And so while we were trying to start a whole farm, and while my belly was growing big, we started this program called Farm for Familias and started delivering meals to families in Little Village in the South Side. So we also starting a lot more organizing with Englewood, and just to see how our communities can work together. And as if you are from La Villita or have been around La Villita, you also know there was a lot of really painful animosity against Black folks in La Villita last year, which basically woke a lot of folks up, and a lot of us really had to step up and do a lot of cross-community organizing and intra-community healing as well. We decided to do that through food. And I know it looks different. I know it's probably not seen, but that's you know, we all have a space in this giant puzzle, and I feel like that was our little piece. So we started working with Getting Grown Collective in Englewood, and with a few community chefs, and started delivering meals. So the first 3 months of my pregnancy were like labeling meals and packing meals and delivering meals while I was really nauseous. And then people were like, "Why are you so moody?" And I'm like, and then you don't want to tell people because you're like, you know, moving your body so much. So a lot of my first 3 months were like trying to get food to people really quickly, and hustle produce for free, and making sure we're making sure we have enough delivery drivers, and all of that. I feel like the first 3 months were a lot, but we were able to build really beautiful relationships. And this program started with a team of like 3-4, and now it's a team of, I think, 15 people, very much from La Villita and the South Side. So we have youth coordinators, we have delivery drivers, we have folks that help pack the meals. And we've actually been able to build these really beautiful relationships between La Villita and Englewood through food, through gardening, through food preparations, through recipe exchanges, through like young people just kind of like packing meals together and like handing out tamales to each other. So it has been really beautiful. But I would say that if it wasn't for that particular kind of like, if it wasn't for food and food work, I don't know that I would have stayed in organizing. I don't know that I would have stayed committed, specifically to like, I feel like there were a lot of things that require very rapid responses. And I felt that in my body that I couldn't. I started feeling a lot of fear. And that is a part of parenthood that I don't think I was expecting, is the concern and the fear that you have, where every single choice that you make could have really strong potential consequences on your family. And I feel like that really kind of like, it came to me very strongly. And I would say the pandemic made it significantly worse. Now I have a 10-month-old. I feel like I'm still very wary of where I bring my child, but also looking forward to ways to stay connected with comunidad, specifically comunidad that don't necessarily have internet access, where Zoom isn't a thing, but still how do we build community with each other and build resilience with each other? And also for me to bring my child to this, to community that has seen me grow as well. I'm very much looking forward to that, but I don't know that I know yet what's the safest way to do it while protecting each other. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I was kind of hoping to like take my child to my meetings and be like, take care of my child while I run this meeting. And like, that's not at all. It's like, we're like sheltering our child because they're not vaccinated. Actually, the last 2 years have been the most difficult. I think when I was pregnant, this was 3 years ago, actually, the first 3 months we were like on a strike and it was freezing outside. So definitely the first 3 months it's intense to go through, like so much work. But I do think that the last 2 years has been really traumatic, just a lot. But something else that happened was the uprisings, right? Which is, there's also a lot of beauty in just the amount of rising up and just all the coming together of like young people, Black people, people of color, everybody just, even like a lot of white people, which is like interesting to see, just the diversity of, was hopeful to see just like how much folks were outraged and standing up for when George Floyd was murdered by police. And in Little Village, Vivi mentioned it, right? There was all kinds of stuff happening. Black and brown animosity was at its peak. And but I wasn't expecting to have to take action, right? At the same time, there was an explosion in Little Village, right? So like Hilco, and honestly, I think like a lot of the times, like I see climate justice and I see it as something very beyond my immediate urgency, right? Or my immediate reality, right? Because there's so many other issues that are so much pressing in my everyday existence that can't even think how like in 10 years or 20 years, how, you know, there will be no like good, healthy environment for me or my children or anybody else. But when the Hilco explosion happened, I was like, oh shoot, like I knew we didn't have the best air quality in my neighborhood, but that was just like blatant racism by the part of the mayor, and allowing that explosion to happen. At the same time, you know, there's like the uprisings happening. And I really, you know, I found myself having to take action with other members of Little Village, right? Other community residents, and essentially like left my childcare to my partner, right? Like, here, take care of our child. I have to go to a meeting, and just like the support that I got from my partner, I think was really, really key in being able to also participate. So thank you all for sharing just like how much we give to the movement, to our work, to our community, to our children, to the children of others, and to really finding love and using that love to really transform and to breathe hope into the work that we do. And I'm not sure if we're at time with our panelists, and if we're opening up to questions and answers. But I think it's about that time. If somebody wants to tell me to keep going, I will keep going.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. My name is Jorge. I use he and him pronouns, and I'm one of the staff members at the LCC. First, thank you to all of the panelists for sharing your personal trajectories and experiences with us so far. I don't think I'm alone in saying that your words and your stories have really moved us and given us plenty to engage with. We have about 15 minutes or so left. So as Rebecca was saying, we want to invite anyone who has a comment or a question to share. Please do so. Feel free to write your comments or questions in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand by using the reaction button on Zoom so that we can call on you. I see on the chat already some folks saying mucho agradecimiento to these four amazing women, mothers, and leaders, Vivi, Gabby, Evelyn, and Rebecca, for sharing your stories and powerful energy. Thank you so much. One of the questions that has come up is sort of looking at the country's COVID response and the current state of immigration, student debt, criminal punishment, abortion rights, et cetera, right? The list can go on. It's easy to feel sort of disillusioned. And Evelyn really made the point of how important it is to be politically involved, not just in voting, but outside of voting. So I think one of the questions is, how do you respond to folks who feel disillusioned by electoral politics? What other ways do you encourage folks to be politically involved?
Can I say something as a person that has never been involved in any sort of electoral politics organizing? I would say that a lot of the policies that end up having positive changes for our community are always driven by organizers and by communities on the ground. Honestly, obviously, there's layers and layers and layers of how any of that can become legislation, but all like any fight, any gain, anything at all is always driven by organizers on the ground. Many of them parents, many of them folks that probably don't think that their little granito de arena, right, their effort that they're putting forth is not enough, but it's honestly is world shaping, is like neighborhood shaping, and it's policy shaping as well. I'm also shouting out fellow parent Juliana Pino, who's a environmental policy master here in the house. In that I just also want to shout them out as a fellow parent, but also as a person that directly organizes with community and then takes that into policy change, specifically as it looks for like, what does it look like to have clean air in our community? What does it look like to have to shift away from extractive economies that we see every day in La Villita? What does it look like to advocate so all of the hundreds of lead water pipes in Chicago get changed? So there's a lot of that work, but a lot of that is always driven and directed by comunidad.
De acuerdo, for sure, Vivi. I think also just parenting itself is radical, right? Mothering is radical, and like in terms of how we are raising the semillitas, right? I think in mirroring in ways where in a world that we want to see, and in addition to or aside of like electoral politics, I think it's more of like what can our role be in like helping shape what we want to see, and that can look in so many ways, right? And I think it can be. I also want to shout out my mom who is on here, pero and just like being able to see how her work as a mother has impacted me in terms of who I want to be as a mother and who I am connecting with in my community of what we're trying to, what we want to envision. So right now she continues to organize, right? So she's a community organizer and has done work around immigrant rights and cultural work. And right now is leading a program in Memphis, Tennessee called Desayuno con Libros for like young people to come to community parks to learn to read and with literacy also do political education. And so like being able to do that through like, as I think we can see it in various ways, whether it's land work or whether it's birth work or whether it's cultural work, cada quien tiene su granito de arena to be able to create change and create those ways for change. And I think just being able to do it in the society or in a world where we as brown people are not expected to is in a sense resistance.
We have another comment from UIC students that says, you all are very empowering, especially understanding motherhood through a progressive versus traditional lens that a lot of us Latina daughters grow up in. That kind of leads to another question around, a lot of our audience members are UIC students, some who are nearing graduation in various fields. And Gabby, you used the word, you chose parenthood, and Vivi as well, as a queer couple. What advice do you have for folks who feel as if they have to choose between parenting and having a fulfilling career, or feel that sort of pressure from themselves, from their career, from their families, etc.?
I can share a bit, and I've said this to a few folks that I've talked to about, their potential journeys are as parents while holding multiple jobs and businesses and careers that are fulfilling, and that you can still kind of like keep your identity, right? Because that's a big part of parenthood, that you kind of start, like your identity starts floating up in the air for a little bit, and then you're trying to like catch back up to yourself and figure out who you are after you have a baby. I think having community is absolutely important. Whether you are a single parent or parenting with other folks, or co-parenting with a friend or co-parenting with a romantic partner, community is important. Bio chosen. Honestly, I feel like I probably wouldn't have made the choice to become a parent, having a job and a business at the same time, if I didn't have a supportive community. a supportive work environment and a supportive co-conspirators in Catatumbo to kind of let me have a break, to let me be a parent and bond with my child with enough time without necessarily being like, you need to come back, you need to give us all your attention, and understanding that now my capacity looks different. Now my attention looks different. My intentions also look a little bit different. And having understanding folks around you, I think, is really key. And to kind of let you come back at your own pace, and also uplift the part that once you become a parent, if you're still very passionate about your career, I feel like there's a lot of like, once you become a parent, that becomes your one identity, and being able to have folks around you that also honor that, all the very, like probably like all the other parts of yourself that are also very important. Because those parts, if you enrich them, they also make you a better parent as well, because you become a lot more centered and a lot more grounded in yourself. So I feel like that's my little piece of advice.
And I think similarly, I think we all have like a path. We had a different motherhood path. And I think that for me, I didn't know if I wanted to be a mom. I think I talked to one of my coworkers who's on here now that I wasn't sure when I was like first with my partner, who early on knew that they wanted to be a parent. And I was just like, all right, that's cool. Let's just, keep this going because it's good. But the reality was I was still kind of finding myself, right? Even as I finished UIC, I was still trying to figure out what is it that was going to fulfill me, what was going to be my passion, where was life going to take me, right? Because you kind of finish undergrad and you have student loans and all this other baggage on you. And I think that for me, it really did take kind of finding myself and finding space to want to bring in another human being that I felt comfortable in, right? And I think that having that community and that family support, I work for a labor union that represents predominantly Black and Brown childcare workers, and I know how essential their work is, and I think the pandemic has shed a light on it. But the reality is, if we didn't have either family helping to support care for like our children, like we would have, I don't know where we would have been. I think one of us would have had to leave our work and figure it out and how to get back into the workforce. But I think the reality is that childcare plays such a vital, important role in not just caring for our children, but like helping develop them as like the human beings that they're going to be. And so I just wanted to note that I think that we kind of, I kind of found myself first and like who I wanted to be, and just like decided to bring another human being into the space. And I think I'm lucky that I had that opportunity and I was able to make that decision, because I know it's not for everybody. So it's just kind of my take on it.
Can I just say I waited as long as possible to have a child? Like I pretty much waited till I was like, okay, this is probably should have it now, or I don't think this is ever going to happen. But and then soon after I had my child, I actually ended up like I think a year later ended up getting promoted at work, right, and with added responsibility. And so I do feel like in some ways I didn't see myself with children. That wasn't my path. But stuff happens, and very, very proud to be a parent. But I also felt like I was able to do the stuff that I wanted, and I think had kind of found my path before making that decision. And although I agree with Vivi, once you become a parent, or a mother, your identity does get kind of tossed up in there, and you try to find out, see where it lands. And I think that's the first year is extremely difficult when you're trying to figure that out.
Thank you all for those responses. I think to sort of get us to a place where we can wrap up, I want to point to Rosa's question, and I'll add a second. So in this moment, where do you see the greatest optimism for positive change? And maybe tied to that question, to end us on a positive light, what have been some of the most rewarding experiences within your organizing and your activism that you could share with us?
I think now as a parent, and even before becoming a parent, like for me, being in movement work and being able to see familias like fully engaged, like fully find and feel safe in space has been to exhibit their boldness, to exhibit like, yeah, I think that has been rewarding and transformational. So I think I can think about an action that I think at this point we were still Ijul or maybe Okada at that point, but there was an action outside of a detention center, and where we cuffed ourselves to a bus, a deportation bus, that was holding one of our community members who had been fighting his deportation case for months and months. And Octavio is his name. And Octavio, we knew about his case because of his family, because of his mother, who just shared his story over and over again, and just was committed to seeing her son free. And at this action, I was one of the persons on the bus, and I could hear the stomping of people inside the bus, and I could hear the shackles hit the floor of the bus because they also wanted to see Octavio be with his mother. They also wanted to themselves be with their families. And that is something that I will always take with me, because that image shows up in various ways. So that is one way, right? But I also see cases like Genoveva, who is a grandmother, who was also fighting to be released, right? And to be with her daughter and her grandkids, right? And I can also see just so many mujeres who are organizing inside the Huddle Detention Center in Texas, right? Who are speaking out against family separation and still connecting despite like retaliation and fear, speaking out after they've been released, right? So I think it's like this image, but in various transformation, various forms of it, of just like familia, whether it's blood family or chosen family, but really being able to connect us together and hold each other down, and I think and being able to do it because they know that they have community alongside them, right, to support them regardless. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can reminisce on the Ijol/OCAD days forever. But I think for me, I remember so clearly, like the first strike that center workers had and I was like helping lead those efforts, and just like how drained you are, and you really want to see the workers like win. And at that time, my son was a few months old. And I remember pumping on my way to like different sites to see workers and talk to them. And just like that one day strike was like the worst climate bipolar Chicago weather ever. It's like we had really frozen rain in the morning. It was extremely cold. We had a change of clothes at like everybody in our team was ready to change after the first set of 6 a.m. strikes to the other strike line. And just remembering that, like, you know, the only moments that where I got to kind of take a moment to myself was really when I was like pumping for my kid and just like really reflecting on the morning, what happened, and then like going into a different space where I get to see all the workers where we like, you know, went to the headquarters and just like seeing the members who were like, there was no way that they were going to go on strike in my mind. But seeing their faces, and I don't know if they noticed, but it like completely changed the way I felt about just everything and just like where I wanted to be and the work I wanted to continue to do in like organizing workers to really build their collective action and continue to do that in whatever way I can, especially for workers who are like getting paid minimum wage, who have a degree in like an associate's or a bachelor's degree in early learning and are getting paid minimum wage. Like, I was like, I want to be here as much as I can, right? And I think that that for me is kind of like what kind of drives me and what continues to push like my activism outside of my like labor work. So I don't know if anybody else is going to answer. I know we're short on time.
Yes, thank you, Evelyn. I think we can leave it there to be mindful of time. I know people have places to be. Some people have children to pick up, etc. So thank you again to all of our panelists, Gabby, Vivian, Evelyn, and to Rebecca for moderating today's panel. And thank you generally for your openness and your vulnerability. You've given us plenty to think about after the event, including a reminder of our commitments to our communities. Thank you all for joining today's public program. To everyone in the space, please join me in thanking our speakers by using the chat, the reactions button, or by unmuting yourselves now. I also really quickly want to invite everyone to our next Radical Research from BIPOC Scholars presentation scheduled for tomorrow, Wednesday, March 30th at 3 p.m., where Dr. Xiomara from the School of Theater and Music will present. You can register for this event and all of our other events on the LCC website or through our Instagram. That brings our program to a close. Thank you again all for joining us, and we hope you have a lovely rest of your day.